Hi everyone, this is Humiak and welcome back to the Kiwi Tech Tree mod. Now, if you're still listening to this, I haven't completely bored you, so I will go into a little bit more detail about some of the parts and some of the upgrades. Now, I will have another video that talks about Kerbalism, which some of you might see is installed currently. But the Kiwi Tech Tree overall doesn't require that, and just be aware that some of the UI elements that you'll see when I'm talking about parts is coming from Kerbalism, and I'll try to point those out as well. So to start off, we can take a look at the capsule, for instance, the Appaloosa Block 2 from the Mole mod was created by Angel125. We can open up the engineer's report and we can see that it comes in at about 1.5 tons here. And what you'll see is there'll be a few new elements. Some of the stuff is from Kerbalism, so we're just going to ignore that for now. And we want to focus in on a couple of these B9 parts, which is, we'll see the material switch and we'll see the energy density. And this will showcase two different upgrades that are available to the Appaloosa 2. One is, so that the baseline material is going to be based off of the mass that's can generally be defined by the mod author. There will be occasional changes in the mass, very, very rarely, as far as I can recall. However, there is going to be an option to upgrade later in the tech tree for the Appaloosa Block 2 to a composite material, and that'll allow the capsule to have a 20% reduction in dry mass, right? So that's adjusting for the amount of monopropellant and nitrogen and water and oxygen. And that will come in at a cost of about 1,482. And so if you take a look at Kerbal construction time, you'll see the construction time comes in about 5 days and 3 hours. We increase that to the composite material, and you can see that that increases by about another day. Right, so this is part of this idea for the Kerbal Tech Tree mod, is to help create these sort of trade-offs, right? Do we want that additional weight reduction in the part, right, at a cost of, let's say, additional time to build, right, additional Kerbucks to build, right? So that is, I wanted to have this sort of trade-off. So it's not like there might be scenarios where you want it, but there might be scenarios where you're like, we're just happy with the baseline material. Now, in what we also see, right, in Kerbal, normally, right, your batteries will have a specific electric charge, and that's going to be constant throughout the game. But you can think about in real life. We can take a look at our phones or laptops, and we can see that the energy density in batteries has become, I guess, denser over time. This is coming in from a non-engineer, so apologies for the lack of any sort of technical language here. But again, this isn't a historical sort of based mod, but I do want to reflect some historical aspects or some realistic aspects into the game. So your parts in general will start off with, say, 50% density, which is based off of 50% sort of what was defined in the part by the mod author. And throughout the tech tree, right, you can increase, let's say, up to 400% density. So we'll start off with the game capsule would have, let's say, if it was available at the start node, it would have about 210 electric charge, and at 400% density, it would be up to 1,680. Now, I should just make it clear that some of these upgrades are going to be sort of very general, right? So when you upgrade energy density within the tech tree, that's going to be available to all parts that have electric charge. Now, some things like the material switches are going to be sort of specific to a particular mod, or or certain systems, right? Like your Mark 1 or Mark 2 or Mark 3 plane systems will have their own material switches. Some structural parts will have upgrades based off of what tier they appear in. So it's a bit of a mix, but I think overall it shouldn't, with a little bit of practice, it shouldn't be too unclear. Now, it's one of those cases where, again, for the vast majority of upgrades, they're going to be augmenting existing parts. So I'm not going to do sort of completely nerf parts, and you just sort of have to kind of guess where upgrades are just to make them usable. They should be usable from the beginning, and so, but the upgrades will make them a bit better and maybe more useful to keep in sort of rotation as part of parts that you're using for your spacecraft later in the tech tree. So that again is sort of the goal here. So let's take a look at, okay, well, we have the boost of Block 2. Now let's add a fuel tank to it, and I think we can maybe say add the FLX to it. Right, so we'll add, we'll convert this, or actually we can showcase another upgrade, and that is, right, for fuel tanks we'll have, especially this will be a little bit different if you don't have cryo tanks installed, but if you do have cryo tanks, what you'll see are differences between, let's say, liquid fuel oxidizer and a composite version of liquid fuel oxidizer. And this upgrade is here in part because the way that cryo tanks is configured, the dry mass of the fuel tank will vary depending on the fuel type, right? So liquid hydrogen dry mass tanks will be lighter than your liquid fuel oxidizer. And so this was implemented in this way, right? So we didn't have scenarios where we ended up having zero mass tanks. But let's take a look at converting that to a liquid hydrogen oxidizer mix for a composite. And we can see just in comparison, right? So we see compared to the liquid hydrogen oxidizer, right, it's a bit lighter, and the dry mass, or it costs more to have that lighter tank. Now, fuel tanks probably won't have a big difference in terms of decreasing as they're not super heavy, at least at this scale. But once you start looking at 3.75 meter tanks or 5 meter tanks, you'll start to really notice the difference in costs. Now, what we can do now is add in an engine, and we can see. Let's take a look at, I think, maybe the Ulysses. I guess it's a little bit large for it. Let's see if we can change. Is there a different mount? Okay, we'll add a compact mount, so at least it's definitely still over too big, but at least it fits, sort of. And now at this point, we can start to look at, we can use the Kerbal Engineer Redux mod to take a look at some of the performance here. So we'll take a look at the altitude of 70 kilometers, so basically in space. So we'll have an ISP of 458 seconds and a thrust of 390 kilonewtons. Now, let's take a look at the upgraded variant, and that's the CE2ZB Nala cryogenic rocket engine, right, which will give you 20% increased thrust, 10% increased specific impulse. And to make your life a bit simpler, I've given an indication of what those actual 20% increased thrust and ISP translates into, right? And so we'll see, say, in a vacuum, you should be expecting 468 kilonewtons of thrust and 503.8 seconds of ISP. So we can click there, and we can see now that's reflected here in those. So that'll help you, right? So you don't have to necessarily rely on Kerbal Engineering Redux or some of the detailed stats in the VAB. So we can quickly take a look. Now let's say we wanted to choose our Methalox variant right here. Right, so we can click on that, and so initially what we can see is it still will show up with some ISP here, right, and now it's gone, right, and that's because, right, we're now using liquid methane and oxygen, right, so we're gonna have to change our fuel tank here to let's say, right, our liquid methane and oxidizer. And now, again, we can see that we have, I guess, sort of a valid sort of situation here in terms of a part that can theoretically fly. And I guess we also have a thrust to weight ratio of 6.92, so we could probably kill the Kerbals quite easily with this. Overall, I think that should be pretty straightforward in terms of those upgrades. We can take a look again. I suppose I am, I guess, in sandbox mode, but we can take a look at, I guess, the A1 Zebulon probe here. here. Actually, we might need to right click here. You can see some of that stuff is from Kerbalism. But we can see that we'll have these SAS upgrades. Now, I started off the all probes will start off with SAS being disabled, and you'll have to go a couple nodes into the tree just to basically turn on basic stability assist. So you might end up having this, like your sort of standard sort of sounding rockets. And however, by the end of the tech tree, you'll be able to have level 3 SAS on every probe. And one of the key aspects of that is, I want to be able to build rockets that are, let's say, that are kind of designed around, let's say, a shape probe, and that might change. I don't necessarily want to choose a probe body based off of its capabilities and whether or not it has the SAS level that I want. One aspect for this is, unfortunately, B9 doesn't allow you to change SAS levels, so we're relying on the stock upgrade system. Ideally, you'd be able to make a choice on what SAS level you have, but that's not currently available. In general, let's see, other aspects, I think. This is not really sort of, I guess, super part specific, but most of your science experiments have been designed and where you don't have to rerun experiments multiple times in a situation to get all of your parts, to get all of your science points. So that's going to be similar to how probes before Crew handled science. I really liked that aspect. Your probes will also get a telemetry experiment to help give you access to a few more points. It's not as critical given the fact that you have planes and you can do crew reports fairly early on in the game, but it's just, again, I don't, we want to make the game enjoyable. I don't necessarily think that we want to be struggling through to unlock nodes. Now, I haven't really played through enough to know what are sort of, I guess, the ideal settings for your science multipliers or money multipliers, for rewards. But I think, in general, you'll need a little bit more science than you would have with other probes before Crew style tech trees. But I have decreased some of the unlock points slightly from stock levels, so that'll help balance that a little bit. One aspect that I've been considering in the future is to base the unlock nodes depending on how many sort of science mods you have installed, So the more science mods you have, the higher unlock costs would be, but that's something that's not really fleshed out yet at this point. Other miscellaneous details, early game, you'll have more parts to play with than you would under stock. As long as you have the custom barn kit enabled or installed, that is, since we're using 0.625 parts, and I give you access to really small fuel tanks to begin with, this helps allow you to make slightly more complex rockets without hitting part count limits really early. I want to limit you slightly, but I don't really want it to be sort of a frustrating experience where you're making really ugly looking rockets just to get them to work, that's not, I don't know, maybe if you enjoy being creative, you can always limit yourself, but I do like my early rockets to at least look like what I should expect rockets to look like, even though I'm not necessarily a good designer. I think overall, that should hit most of the extra details. I think I've talked long enough to bore you. But if you're not bored yet and you do want to know a little bit more about how I've designed Kerbal Tech Tree to work with Kerbalism, stay tuned and I'll talk about that in the next video.